Hello and welcome to my Floss Tube channel. I'm Jean Farish and I am so glad that we get to spend this time together. Today I'm going to do a stitch tutorial. I realize it's been a while since I've done one, and so we're going to talk a little bit about the satin stitch, which is a really interesting stitch in that it's a very simple one, a little bit of a challenge in terms of how to start and stop each one of the satin stitches, but also one that can come in just an infinite number of shapes. And we're going to do a few more FAQs, and we're going to start by talking about linen. And there are a lot of questions about linen, particularly how to stitch it, what the different names mean, the different categories of linen. And I just want to talk in very general terms first. And actually, what inspired me to talk about this are a lot of the FAQs that I get and the comments and things that I see on social media. So Carol sent in this question. She said, what's the difference between Belfast, Cashel, Edinburgh, and Newcastle linen? First, let's talk about what they have in common. Each one of these linens is manufactured by the Zweigart company. Now, Zweigart is a company of long-standing headquarters in Germany and has an excellent reputation in terms of quality and just the range of their product. This is the linen that has the orange stitching in the selvage, which is true of all of their linens and their needlepoint canvases as well, and a way to tell immediately whether or not it's Zweigart canvas or fabric if you have a piece that's got the selvage attached to it. Now, as far as these four linens, they're simply sort of brand names. These are the names that Zweigart has given their linens over the years, and all based on cities of the same name. So where they are different is the count of the threads. Now they're all linen, which means that they're made of 100% flax. The flax plant is the source of linen threads. And to be called linen, it truly should be made from 100% flax. So the difference is in the count, and I'm actually going to start with two that were not on Carol's list. Cork is a 20 count linen. Dublin is 25 threads to the inch. Cashel is 28. Belfast is 32. Edinburgh is 36. And Newcastle is 40. So the difference is in the thread count. Not the color, not the fiber content, because as I said, they're all 100% linen. So depending on how you want to stitch and how big you want the product, the end product to be, then that is how you can choose which of these linens you want to stitch on. Now remember, if you're stitching over 2, then you cut that thread count in half. So a Cashel at 28 threads to the inch, when stitched over 2, becomes 14 stitches to the inch. So if you are accustomed to stitching on Aida, for example, Cashel is a really good linen to start with if you want to make a transition from one to the other. But don't overlook Dublin and Cork as well when you're first making that transition. I think in all cases, it's a good idea to stitch something that's small. And by that, I mean a design that has, a small stitch count, something that's, say, 30 by 30 or 45 by 45, something in that kind of a range, or even fewer stitches. And then from there to learn to stitch over 2. Now, I'm going to include a link to a video I made that's just a good kind of overall for people who are learning to stitch over 2. And I'll put that in the episode description. This is something I made a few months ago, and it's been watched quite a few times by a lot of people. So if you want to make that transition from Aida to linen, or even to even weave fabrics. Now, everything that when I talk about stitching over two, whatever applies to linen is also going to apply to even weaves. So if you want to make that transition, then I would suggest that you take a look at that. Or even if you're not ready to do it and you've got some spare time, take a look at it so you understand a little bit more what people are talking about when they talk about stitching over two on linen or even weaves. So I think that answers Carol's question. Another thing that's come up lately, and I'm sort of excited about this, although I have not participated directly. Floss drops have become a big buzzword in social media, and I personally am excited to see that, because I just think it's I think it's a better way to store your floss. Not quite ready to put that qualifier on it. It's the best way for me. It's the thing that I enjoy the most. And I've talked about this before as far as the pros and cons of stitching, of storing my floss on thread drops. But I thought I would just review that very quickly today. Compared to the floss drops that I'm seeing on social media, mine are pretty much plain Jane. I don't have any details about how this started or how you get involved. And so I'm hoping that some of my viewers who are kind of on the inside track of this information will post a comment or send me an email and tell me about it. But what I'm seeing are posts that people are showing very lovely floss drops that have been handmade by people, that they're exchanging, I don't know, it looks like a quantity, maybe 6 or 8 or maybe even a dozen of very pretty floss drops. And what they've done is posted things about how they've received them from a certain person or whatever, or they've got theirs ready to send off to someone. And I just think that that's just such a cool way for people to connect with each other. And again, I don't have any of the details about how it started, who started it, how you get involved. I just think it's really, really cool. And if I had thought ahead, I would have reached out and asked permission from some of these people that I could share their post here. I don't like to do that without getting the person's acceptance and acknowledgement that it's okay. So, but be on the lookout for that. So I'm just going to talk about just the general principles of floss drops and why I like them. So this is a project that I just finished. As you can see, it hasn't been washed and ironed yet. This is for a class that I'll be teaching on the 2022 cruise. And these are the colors that I used while I was stitching this. So how I've got this set up right now. When I was stitching the green area, I had these 3 just left loose. The rest of the colors, I just put this as a very loose knot on the colors that I wasn't using. And as you can see, the yellows were cut shorter than the other colors. And I'm not really sure why I did that, but I did. So when I'm not actively using a color, I just put it in a loose knot like that just to keep it from getting tangled up. And then the colors that I am using, what I love about this is that I can take my needle. I have a needle here somewhere. Aha, I found it. If I want a strand of this Cosmos 631, and using a loop method, if I'm going to be stitching, starting with a single strand that I'm going to fold in half to use the loop start, I can take my needle and simply grab one thread and pull it out. And as you see, the rest of it gets kind of bunched up, but don't worry about that. It's not getting tangled. It just straightens itself right back up. So that's how I can take out a single strand to use for a loop method. Or if I need to stitch with 2 strands, then I can take out one strand and then the second strand. But that's the thing that I like best about it. Then when I'm done stitching, if I have anything left, some people put a second hole in their floss drops. Instead, I just attach the random leftover thread in the same hole. And then when I'm getting ready to stitch something that I know will take about that length, then I just grab one of those leftover pieces. So this is one of the reasons I like it. And then in terms of storage, so on this ring, these are the colors that I have for a particular project. Oh, and also, while I'm thinking about it, let me show you that I have the brand on there because I do have Cosmo and DMC and Weeks Dye Works, etc. And the color number. And then in pencil, I have put the symbol for that particular color. And I do it in pencil so that I can erase it when I do another project and put the appropriate symbol on the color. And then what I have, like for example, this ring are all my 100s that are Cosmo flosses. And I pretty much keep them in numeric order just because it's faster for me to locate something when I'm ready to look for it. So I have a ring for my 100s, a ring for my 200s, a ring for my 300s, etc. So I can store a lot of floss in a relatively small area. And then I keep them in my closet on a sort of rack that's meant for belts or scarves or whatever that have kind of like little hooks sticking out. And so in a column about this big, I can have hundreds of floss colors. I know that it's protected from sunlight, relatively protected from dust. I'm not the world's best housekeeper, so I'm not saying my house is dust-free. And so these to me are all the benefits of floss drops. Plus, you avoid getting those little zigzaggy bends that you get on bobbins. And probably the biggest thing for a lot of people is the time saving, that you're not spending all that time winding your floss on bobbins. So anyway, so take a look at social media and see if you can find out about this floss drop exchange, and if you're so inclined, participate in it. I think they're lovely. One more thing about floss drops. People are often asking where you get them from. I used to sell them in my Etsy store, and now that I have, big news, I got my booster shot this week, so I'm really excited about that. And as things get safer and I feel like that making trips to the post office are in my best interest, then I'll put them back into my Etsy store. But you can get them from lots of different shops. The best thing to do is just call and ask and see if you can find a source. Now, the ones that I get are packaged like this. There's like 30 in a package, and they come with one ring, and then I supplement my ring supply by getting them in an office supply store. And speaking of stores, people have asked me about the shop that's going to be opening here in Winston-Salem. The owner, Susan, is hard at work getting things organized, and like a lot of people, experiencing a little bit of a delay due to construction issues, but I know she's on target to get open this fall. And as soon as I have any details as far as exactly when her grand opening will be, I will certainly let you know. But it's called Time to Stitch, and if you're familiar with Winston-Salem at all, it's right near the intersection of what we old-timers still call Old 40, which is now designated as 421. It's where 421 and Stratford Road intersect. So very convenient, very easy to find, lots of free parking, some great restaurants nearby, and some other shopping as well. So it will make a great outing when Susan's ready to open her shop. So I'll let you know when I find out. This week I made a big discovery about shops when I called Susan to find out if she had gotten her supply of beads in yet. And she said, well, you know, Jean, there's a really good bead shop downtown. And I kind of was like, oh yeah, I think I've heard about that, but I had never been. So I made my first visit to Studio 2 Beads, which is on Liberty Street. Winston-Salem has a very, very strong arts district, and it's become a foodie area. It's got some great galleries and whatnot, and there are some very active artists of all kinds of different media who have collaborated and built this really lovely area that has a small, sort of a pocket park, just a small park that has benches and some pathways and some really interesting sculpture. And so her shop faces that little park. And the reason I'm bringing it up is when you are in the market for beads, don't overlook just going to a bead shop. I find that the variety of beads that were offered were incredible. The price was great. And I found exactly what I needed. So I really appreciated Susan giving me that suggestion. And I just wanted to share that with you, that wherever you live, take a look and see whether or not there's a bead shop in your area, or if you're traveling and you're looking for local needlework shops to visit, take a look at other types of shops as well that might have the kinds of things that embellish our needlework. I'm not sure who to credit this comment to, because her or his name on the little, the tagline, whatever you want to call it, just said, "Oh, brag one." But this is the comment that I wanted to share with you. I had been going to an office supply store to get working copies of my charts printed, but discovered that the library was more convenient. However, the library machine scanned the piece first, and the photocopy ended up looking pixelated and much harder to read. My suggestion is to have a sample printed first before paying to have the whole chart copied. And that's really important if you've got something that's huge, like America Land That We Love is 36 pages. So it would be really a shame to pay for 36 pages and not have any idea what quality copy you're going to get. Now, this comment came after last week when I was sharing the fact that if you don't have a printer at home, that doesn't mean you can't buy PDF copies of a chart. You can download the PDF at home, save it to some sort of a thumb drive, or email it to a company that has a print service. And many of them will then mail it to you. So if, like me, you're still being cautious about making trips outside your home, let me back up. I'm not going to say I'm feeling cautious about it, but I am still somewhat limiting my trips and asking myself, is there another way of doing this other than doing it in person? So if you're still in that category, or maybe transportation is a challenge for you, or you've got little ones at home, whatever, explore these other options as far as ways to get charts printed, and many of them will print them at a nominal charge and then simply mail them to you. So that's an option as well. But as this commenter said, do be cautious that whoever's doing it is not first scanning it with a poor quality scanner and then printing the copy. Because as we well know, being able to identify those symbols on your chart are really important. Okay, so let's talk about the satin stitch. Satin stitches all have certain things in common. One of them is the direction of the stitches. Whether the stitches are vertical, horizontal, or diagonal, all of them should be executed in the same sort of direction. In other words, if you're working something, the stitches are vertical and you're going bottom to top, bottom to top, bottom to top, or that same stitch can be done top to bottom, top to bottom, top to bottom. Whichever way you choose to stitch it, just stick with one way or the other. Same thing if it's diagonal. if you're stitching on a diagonal like this, then each time you're going from the bottom to the top, then that's what you do. So on the back, you get the padding of a satin stitch. And when you are finished, that extra padding is what raises that satin stitch above the surface of the fabric, because you've got stitches on the top and the bottom that are kind of giving it a little bit of a loft. And it just really makes the satin stitches stand out. So let's talk about how to do it. Now, I'm not using a particular chart here. I'm just gonna randomly stitch and show you a couple of things. As I said in my introduction, one of the challenges with satin stitch is starting and ending the stitches, and that's primarily because there's no place to actually anchor the thread securely within the satin stitch. Because the satin stitches tend to be long, then there's no place to really grab it on the back. So that becomes a challenge. But first, before I get into showing how to begin and end the stitches, I'm going to simply stitch with a waist knot. So if I'm going to make my satin stitch in this area, for example, I'm going to put my waist knot over here. And let me come in a lot closer here. And I'm going to be stitching over the back of my, I'm going to be stitching over the trailing thread as I'm creating the back stitches. So I'm just going to do a simple satin stitch on the diagonal. So I'm going to go up 1, 2, 3 and over 1, 2, 3. Now I lost my count. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. Okay, so that gives me a 45-degree angle. Now, satin stitches very often are interesting shapes. So when you are stitching a satin stitch, usually you're going to make whatever changes you make by going over one thread wide and one thread deep, or in this case going down one and over one. Now, the critical thing with a satin stitch is making sure that your two floss threads are even, they're parallel to each other and they're not twisted in any way. So in this case, I am keeping my top straight, and across the bottom each time I'm coming down one thread and over one thread. Now, there are instructors who will advise you, if you're stitching with 2 strands, to do your satin stitch with a single strand and stitch 2 stitches in each place. I have tried that, and I personally do not find it to be advantageous. So now right here, you're seeing a little bit of a gap. And that's because, again, the nature of linen is that I've got a fat thread right there. So I'm going to have a gap right there. But as you can see, I've got a stitch in between each linen thread. And for this reason, satin stitch does not work for Aida, because you've got to be able to come in between each linen thread. So you can, it's great for creating leaves. I've done heart shapes. Now, if I'm ready to make shorter stitches, the next one, I'm going to come over one and up one. And I'm still working on the diagonal. So over one and up one. And this, I think, becomes part of the challenge of a satin stitch. I don't know if I can come in even closer. Because the stitches themselves sort of hide where your next stitch needs to go. So again, I'm coming from my last stitch. I like to put my needle where that last stitch was. So I come over one and up one. And that really helps me keep my place. So you can see on the back where I have covered this thread, but because these stitches got longer and longer, that's not really as secure as I would like it to be. So that becomes a question. How do we begin our satin stitches, and how do we end them so that they are secure? Also, by the way, as I just did, check to make sure the threads are parallel to each other before you start the next stitch. It's pretty easy to fix it if you are looking at just the last stitch that you did. So one of the ways to end your thread is to, and this takes some patience with tension, I'm going to come under these threads and then weave back in the other direction. And then weave back yet again in this direction. And that is one way to end your thread. And I could then, had I left this long enough, I could clip off my waist knot and rethread this thread and do the same thing. So that's one way to secure the end of your thread with a satin stitch. Another way is to really take a look at the design. If there are cross stitches around it nearby, you can always secure your thread with within those cross stitches that are nearby. And also in this particular one that I just did, because this first stitch was so small, I could have started that with a loop start. So that's another thing too. If you have, if the design is such that the stitches where you're beginning are only over a couple of threads, then use the loop start when you're stitching with 2 strands. Also, those of you who are familiar with the pin stitch is a good way to start your satin stitch. Just make sure that wherever you're placing that stitch, it's going to be covered by your satin stitches. So there really are a lot of ways that you can start and end your threads for your satin stitch. It's really a lovely stitch, and you know, I would hope that you wouldn't avoid certain charts or designs because they have satin stitch in them, because it really is it's a sort of stitch where, as I said in the outset, it's a simple stitch where I think the challenge is really looking at your stitch diagram to know exactly how the designer wants that shape to be, and to know that you're going in and out every linen thread. You're not, even if the rest of the pattern is stitched over 2, when you're stitching the satin stitch, you're going in and out each one of the thread intersections. And then sometimes, as I was just stitching, the change is only on one side of it, and sometimes it's on both. So it really has an infinite number of varieties as far as the shape is concerned. And all you need to do is just pay attention to your stitch diagram and know that whatever direction you're stitching in, bottom to top, or top to bottom, but do not mix the two within one motif. If there are a lot of leaves on a pattern and you start one of them bottom to top, and then 2 days later you're doing one top to bottom, that's okay. They're two different motifs, and that would be all right. So it's a fun stitch. It actually goes pretty quickly, and it just adds a really nice texture to samplers and other designs as well. So I hope that you try it. I don't often talk about what I'm going to be doing the next week, but I want to address one of the most common questions about counter cross stitch. And I don't have samples prepared, and that's what I need to do so I can really talk about it more in depth next week. But it's a question of how to stitch cross stitch so that the fabric doesn't show through. Now, I'm making that as a statement, and yet it's one that I can't completely agree with. When I am doing my cross stitch, I am not the least bit concerned as to whether or not any of the fabric, what we refer to as the ground cloth, it doesn't matter to me whether or not it is showing through. I see countless comments from people who want to know how they can make their cross stitches so none of the fabric shows through. And I'm here to tell you that in its most traditional, historic sense of cross stitch, no one was concerned as to whether or not the fabric showed through the back. And in fact, there are many people who stitch what we refer to as primitive or prim designs who want their fabric to show. So this is a sort of thing where there is no right or wrong. There's like a continuum of there are people or stitchers over here who say, I don't want any of my fabric showing. How can I make that happen? And people over here who say, I want to make my stitches fine enough that my fabric is clearly showing through. And then there are people in the middle, which is kind of where I put myself, that say, hey, I'm going to make really great cross stitches, and if the fabric shows, so be it. So I have certainly done my share of solid area stitching that I'm sure that if you look very, very closely, you can see some of the fabric. I'm not concerned about it. However, if you are concerned, here are my suggestions. First of all, make sure when you're stitching that assuming that you're stitching with 2 strands of floss, make sure that your 2 strands of floss are indeed lying parallel to each other, that they're not overlapping, that they're not twisted. And I would say that that's true of both halves of the cross stitch. Again, one of the more common things I see people post on social media is that they only pay attention to that with the top leg of their cross stitch. If you're on that spectrum over here where you don't want your ground cloth to show at all, do make sure that your stitches are parallel to each other, both the bottom leg and the top leg of every one of your cross stitches. That's the first thing. Second thing is the most common correction I see people talk about is changing from stitching with 2 strands to stitching with 3 strands so they get better coverage. Now, if you're now stitching with 3 strands, now you've got 3 strands you're trying to keep parallel to each other, which to me is even more of a challenge. So if you can't keep 2 strands parallel to each other, I don't know what makes you think you can get 3 strands parallel to each other. So that's kind of what's in the back of my mind when I see all these comments. An easier way would be to change the fabric count. So if you're stitching with, say, 14 stitches to the inch, and you feel like too much of the fabric is showing, change to 15 or 16 stitches to the inch, or even 18 stitches to the inch, still stitching with 2 strands, keeping them parallel, and see if that doesn't give you the coverage that you want. So again, next week, I'm going to have some samples stitched up ahead of time so that I can kind of show you what I'm talking about. And again, to me, there is no right or wrong wherever you are on that spectrum, whether you want 0 ground cloth to show, moderate amount in the middle, and lots of ground cloth to show on the other end of the spectrum. Doesn't really matter. There is no right or wrong. I do think that it's more of a trend now with full coverage pieces of people who want almost like a tapestry look to their work, and they don't want any of that ground cloth to show. And again, if that's, as the kids say, if that's their jam, then that's fine. It's not mine, and it may not be yours. And again, this is a no judgment zone. This is a, let's get the pleasure out of your needlework. And, within the range of best practices, anything goes. And to me, the best practice when you're stitching with 2 strands is keeping those 2 strands parallel to each other. So that's it for today. Like I say, next week I'm going to talk about keeping, showing samples of different amounts of ground cloth showing and what you can do or not do about it. And I also want to talk more about stitching in hand, and particularly those that are stitching with on America land that we'd love, or any sort of a large piece. How do you manage all that fabric and still stitch in hand? So that's what's coming up next week. I hope between now and then that you stay safe and stitch happy, and I'll see you then.